Well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I didn't know if you would show up when you saw that the topic was going to be silence. It seems very strange to me to be talking about silence, but I'm going to be talking about silence. And I brought a friend of mine for you to see, to meet. She's right here below this candle. Can you see her? If you can't see her now, you will see her when you walk out. When we were in our dining room at the monastery in Ferdinand, we have several trees outside our dining room window. And in one of our trees at lunch one day was this nice little raccoon. And there he was, she was, just laying on that thing, and you see how her legs are just drooping there, And as we looked at her, it was almost like she could hear us, because we said, "Is she alive? I wonder if she's alive." And then she raised her head up and looked over at us like, "Yes, I'm alive. See, I'm alive." And then she just put her head right back down again and looked quite relaxed, quite like she was in silence. She didn't really want to talk to us. She was going to keep some silence and have a little still time, quiet time. And a couple of days later, I was outside on that side of the monastery walking around, and I saw her go through the field. Out from underneath that window in that tree, she was followed by 4 little babies. So now I know why she was resting, because I think she just about had it, huh? But anyway, one of our guests that was there had, we weren't allowed our cell phones in the dining room, so she took a picture of it and sent it to me so I could use it for my talks. I don't always remember to do it and don't always do it, but I thought you'd enjoy it. So we're going to talk about the spirit of silence. It's certainly, believe it or not, silence is certainly a great teacher. And to learn its lessons, you really have to pay a lot of attention to it, to this silence that we are going to talk about, that we as monastics really value. There's no substitute for the creative, I think, inspiration, the creative knowledge, the stability that comes from knowing how to contact that inner core of silence within ourselves. The great Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "Only let the moving waters calm down, and the sun and the moon will be reflected on the surface of your being." And it's so true. It isn't until we calm down. We've got a couple of beautiful ponds on our Ferdinand property, and when it's real calm and it's really still, then we can see those pine trees beside it reflected in the water. And I think it's that silence within us that really gives us a very solid reflection of the God around us, the God around us. There are some evenings when that small pond is really reflective, and I love to go down there at that particular time, except when it's 95, like it's been lately in southern Indiana. It's so hot. But I think this reflection on this beautiful surface of the moon and the trees and everything, the sun even, I think such reflection is only possible when that pond is really perfectly still. And the monastic environment, I think, provides us with that same calming, that same quieting atmosphere, a time of really rejuvenation of the spirit when we have that silence. In other words, be still and know that I am God. That was my final vows theme. Be still and know that I am God. This is why we make retreat every year, just to have time to be still and know that I am God. I'm not God. Remember, I'm not God. God's God. What a relief it is. Just be still and remember God is God. We're not. I was going to read for you chapter 6 of the rule, but to keep it from 3 hours of talk this afternoon, I won't read it. But I would encourage you this evening to take some time to read chapter 6 of the rule on silence, on the spirit of silence. So take some time and think about it. We're going to kind of be going through some of it here anyway, so we'll be touching base with it for sure. It's pretty interesting that how together chapter 6 of the rule goes and chapter 7 on humility. They're very connected, very connected. All right, Benedict, I think he gives us clear reasons for practicing silence. Why we're practicing silence? What are we doing that for? You know? Well, he says, first of all, it's to avoid falling into sin. Falling into sin. That's why we practice silence. To avoid falling into sin. We're going to say more about that. 2, because the importance of the spirit of silence. That's another reason, because of the importance of the spirit of silence. And he uses phrases like out of esteem for silence and so important is silence. So important. So you get the feeling from him. It's very important. It's very esteemed. And thirdly, as an expression of docility to and for reverencing for God. Expression of docility. Docility to and reverence for God. Speaking and teaching. Benedict says, speaking and teaching are the teacher's task. The disciples is to be silent and to listen. He uses that word silent quite a bit all the way through the rule. Other than chapter 6, Benedict also has a trilogy on the questions of monastic silence in the Instruments of Good Works in chapter 4. He again talks about it. What does he say? To guard the tongue against evil and depraved speech. Wow. I think that's interesting, isn't it? That's in chapter 4 now. We're in chapter 4 on the Instruments of Good Works. To guard one's tongue against evil and depraved speech. And then in verse 52 of 4, he says, not to love much talking. Not to love much talking. You know, go on. And that is the epitome of the chapter, the 9th degree of humility. The 9th degree of humility. And then verse 53 of 4 says, not to speak useless words or words that move to laughter. Words that move to laughter. And that one suggests what's at the 11th degree of humility. So they're kind of connected there to humility again. And then, verse 51 and chapter 6 stress the evil tendencies of the human tongue. Verses 52 and 9, degree of humility, encourage the monastic to talk as little as possible. Verse 53 and the 11th degree of humility obligate the monastic to clothe her speech with qualities reflecting seriousness and gravity of purpose. All right, let's look at the first one in a little bit more degree. You can take just a brief look at St. Benedict's reason to avoid sin, he says. To avoid sin. In much speaking, he says, you will not avoid sin. Have you ever noticed that in your conversation? Just pay attention sometimes. You know, you start on a really good topic, you're talking just about really nice things, and before you know it, you're talking about Sister Kunigunda and some things you don't like about her. You know? Have you ever noticed that? It just kind of turns and you're not even aware of it. And it just kind of moves on you, and before you know it, you're into negative conversation. And it says again in Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, the tongue holds the key to life and death. Oh, that's interesting. St. Benedict here, I think, shows clearly his understanding of our weak human nature. He knows what it's like. In too much needless chatter, you will not avoid sin. And surely, as I said, that's my experience. And I'm sure that's yours too, but I won't ask you to admit to that at all here today. But it just seems like that's what happens. St. Benedict emphasizes, I think, the psychological and emotional control a monastic possesses when she is able to get full mastery of her tongue. When she's able to really control that little tongue of hers, then she's got it. I think in control of the emotions, she in turn exercises control over the deepest part of herself. And the deeper inner sanctum of the soul, as I like to call it, that deeper inner sanctum of the soul. Control of the tongue is truly the key to personal emotional stability even, or emotional maturity. Have you ever noticed how much calmer and how much more together you feel on days when you have a day of solitude or a retreat day, when you're not talking a lot and you're in silence? Have you noticed how much calmer you feel? I do. I love to take, every month, I take one day, we call them a desert day for a desert day. And it's a day of just total quiet. And it does help calm me down, you know? It's just because I'm not jabbering all over the place. You know, it's just calming. It's so quieting. You feel less fragmented, you know, a little more together. You feel renewed after a day like that, or hopefully after a time of retreat as well. So control of the tongue is really the key to personal emotional stability, isn't it? It just gives us that calm. St. Benedict also expresses silence to be an effect of guardian of peace of the soul whenever the monastic has to endure hard or contrary things, even injuries or injustices, and obeying its superiors or other community members. By encouraging to hold fast to patience, he tells us encourages us to hold fast to patience with a quiet mind. That's the fourth step of humility, huh? It connects to that. At these times, you know, it's kind of difficult to do that for sure, but we keep trying. You know, and I love this in the prologue of the rule. Is there anyone here who yearns for life and desires to see good days? Me, for sure. Yeah, I do. If you hear this and you ask, and your answer is, I do, God then directs these words to you. If you desire true and eternal life, I thought he was going to come with some really easy, nice, beautiful things. He says, keep your tongue free from vicious talk and your lips from all deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Let peace be your quest and your aim. Oh, okay. So, in other words, he's saying in essence, be kind. Be kind, in essence, I think. And this is also the beautiful description of purity of heart that many of the Desert Fathers and Mothers talked about. The purity of heart. And that's how we get it, by keeping our inside pure. And of course, we all know that Benedict's strong feelings against what? Murmuring. I knew you were going to know that one. Murmuring, huh? That was a big one for him. He refers to it, and as I told you, I'm a counter. He refers to it at least 14 times in the rule. He refers to murmuring. And often we combat, these evil thoughts most effectively if we absolutely refuse to allow them to be expressed in words. If we just refuse to allow them to be expressed in words, judgment can be curbed and smothered by never allowing them the right to be uttered. We don't say them. In the letter of James, we read, the one who holds her tongue in check controls mind and body. Wow, that's St. James, chapter 3. The one who holds her tongue in check controls mind and body. Wow. And I think Holy One's tongue is really one of the most important monastic instincts to be cultivated. We try as Benedictines not to murmur, not to murmur. Benedict does not teach total silence. That is the absence of all speech. He doesn't say we should be constantly quiet. No, he has us encouraging each other gently in the mornings to be sure that we are up talk to us, get us up for morning prayer. Don't sleep in, honey, time to get up. Come on, get up. And we do that gently, quietly, wake them up. But his caution is around perhaps the loudness or disruptiveness of the spirit of silence, as well as the quality of the conversation. It should not be mean-spirited. And I noticed an interesting footnote in the RB 1980, which has wonderful stuff in it, and then a footnote in there I read and really, really liked it. In verse 8 of chapter 6, Benedict says we should absolutely condemn in all places any vulgar and gossip and talk leading to laughter, and we do not permit a disciple to engage in words of that kind. And then when you put that in Latin, because the RB 1980 has Latin on one side and English on the other side, the Latin words for the absolutely are aeterna clausura. Aeterna clausura. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it exactly right. For those of you who are Latin, spot, you can tell me later how I'm supposed to say that. Aeterna clausura, two separate words. The image in Latin is that of, obviously, enclosure. Enclosure. In other words, what they say in there is the mouth is like the door of an inner cloister. Now think about that. That's an interesting concept, isn't it? Think about the mouth as the door of an inner cloister. So, I like that image. It was pretty good. So St. Benedict wants the door closed to certain kinds of speech, in other words. In the master, the rule of the master, he develops the image much more elaborately, allowing for some degree of enclosure. We can kind of start on that. And we should be moved away from laughter. And I always bothered me, and then of course I had the absolute joy and gift to be I was on the staff of the Rome Renewal Program that we had for 15 years in Rome, and I had asked Sister Aquinata if she promised me she would give a week or 2 weeks on the rule if I got that program going. And that's all she had to tell me. Boy, that fired me up, and I made sure I got that renewal program going so that we could all benefit from Sister Aquinata's beautiful renditions of the rule. She's so good. And I asked her, I said, Aquinata, why does Benedict say we shouldn't laugh? That really always kind of bothered me because, I'm an extroverted, laugh, smiley kind of person, But she explained to me how many of the people that were in his monastery in those days were pretty rough characters. And some of them were even assigned to his monastery due to violence or something that they did wrong. It was like a prison. And, some of these guys were pretty rough guys, and they would get into dirty conversation, some very unnice, unhealthy conversations, and they would get to laughing. And she said that's the kind of laughter he was trying to get away from, the unhealthy kind of things that were going on in his day. So that made me feel better about laughter. Okay, the second reason Benedict gives for in the chapter 6 on the practice of silence is the importance of the spirit of silence. The importance of the spirit of silence. Since the spirit of silence is so important, permission, he says, should rarely be granted. St. Benedict distinguishes between silence, that is, refraining from speaking, and the spirit of silence, which is just a little bit different. In that case, silence itself must be so strictly practiced that the tongue must be so drastically curtailed in its function, because otherwise it's not possible to have a spirit of silence. The one is there, therefore, means to the other. The silence creates a spirit of silence. And then that silence, the silentium as he uses in Latin again, begets taciturnity. So, when people come into your monastery and our monastery, they always mention how quiet it is there. And I think we don't even recognize how we really are contributing to the spirit of silence by not yelling at each other across the way and, playing our radios full blast or televisions or, we're very sensitive, I think, to the spirit of silence. And it's so important because that spirit of silence is what begets taciturnitas. And I like that word. This taciturnitas is important, I think, in a monastery. That permission to speak, he says, should be rarely granted, even to the perfect ones, even though it be for good, holy, edifying conversation. In other words, we have to be sensitive to the spirit of silence within the house. And taciturnitas is really that atmosphere of quiet, the tranquility and stillness of order, the peace, and again, our word, harmony, the peace and harmony within the walls of the monastic dwelling. Taciturnitas is not silence, it's the spirit of silence, and the atmosphere of Benedictine serenity and joyous peace. That's what, think of taciturnitas as that, as serenity, serenity and the joyous peace. Silence is the absence of speech. The spirit of silence is obtained when the spatial areas of the Benedictine home are bathed in the atmosphere free of all useless noise, confusion, and the discord of sounds. So taciturnitas is really the breath of God's presence. It's the breath of God's presence. I love to think of taciturnitas as that, the breath of God's presence. Taciturnitas, in a word, really is monastic serenity. Monastic serenity. Once a monastic understands the nature of and necessity of taciturnitas, then she will understand also that 11th degree of humility. For taciturnitas regulates not merely the amount of speech, but its manner as well. When monastic speaks, she should do so gently, without laughter, humbly and seriously, in a few sensible words. The true monastic is she who, when she speaks, does so gently and with delicacy, respecting God's presence and the feelings of those around her, humbly, sensibly, and with few words as possible. So thirdly, and the last one here, silence is an expression of docility and reverencing God. Docility and reverencing God. So lastly, we come to consider this principal reason suggested by St. Benedict again in chapter 6 of the Rule. The monastic must practice silence and must be surrounded by spirit of silence and serenity in order to develop reverence for God's presence, docility to God's grace, and attentiveness to God's word. Silence nurtures the spirit of adoration, of mindfulness, and presence. So silence nurtures those three things that are so important to us. Adoration, mindfulness, which we're going to talk about in one of my other talks, and presence, which we talked about this morning. That silence helps us to be more mindful, to be more aware of God's presence. And I think by monastic profession, the monastic is a lifelong monasticism, really. It's a lifelong, and the students in it, all of us are still students. It doesn't matter how old we are. I'm 72. I feel old most of the time. Sometimes I think I'm in my 40s, but every now and then I look at my license and I see I'm really 72. It doesn't matter. I'm still a student. I'm still a student. We're lifelong students in this school of the Lord's service, aren't we? St. Benedict insists on this student-like receptivity. Permission to speak should rarely be granted, even to the perfect disciples. For speaking and teaching belong to the teacher. The disciples' part is to listen, to be silent and listen. Our teacher is usually our Christ, huh? That's our teacher. And our Lexio, our God. In all humility, the disciples of Christ is silent, silently attentive to the Lord, as we listen for the Vox Domini, the voice of the Lord, the voice of God. We're listening for that Vox Domini, the voice of the Lord talking to us. The monastic listens to the teachings of the leaders in community and the Word of God in our Lexio. A meditative, receptive silence with a peaceful heart, ruminating over the words of counsel that have been shared with us through a prioress, through a friend, through our Lexio. We ponder all of these things just as Mary did during her pregnancy and Christ's infancy. Imagine the thought-provoking things that went through her head at that time. Wow. So the Spirit's silence then it's essential and integral to monastic life. It disposes the environment of the monastery for the peaceful pursuit of prayer. And it creates an atmosphere of peace, that silence does, which the monastic can effectively devote herself to by practicing both obedience and humility. I think it's no coincidence that obedience and humility, those two chapters, are on either side of silence. Chapter 6, 5 obedience, 7 humility. It's not a coincidence. So that's the way Benedict plans everything. That's not a coincidence. Two topics very side by side supporting the silence. All right, and so just to summarize what I've been saying here this afternoon, silence really is reverence for God. It really is reverence for God. Through silence, the monastic respects that presence of God in which she stands every single day. Silence for the monastic is adoration, an act of divine service. And by means of silence, a monastery is established as the school of the Lord's service. That's what a monastery is called, isn't it? A school of the Lord's service. We're still learning. We're still learning. Therefore, the monastic leaves choir in the most profound silence. You know, we all get up, we leave when we hear that volume going. We get up quietly and leave, taking with us whatever we have learned during that liturgy. But silence is not to be left at the chapel door. The monastic, must carry this silent recollection in God into her daily life. Remember, daily matters. The daily matters. Both as an attitude of mind and a practice, a practical mode of behavior. This quiet, reverent silence. God is the master teacher in the monastery. God is the master teacher. For the monastery, remember, is what? Is God's house. The monastery is God's house. We are living in God's house. God's presence must be perceptible fact, pervading the entire monastic establishment. The divine presence made perceptible by the exterior spirit of silence and serenity, and by the interior spirit of recollection. And it becomes the spirit of the Benedictine monastery. In the spirit, in that spirit, I think monastics then can really be in touch with God. We can stay in touch with God. We can stay in communication with God in our silence. We live with God a life of mutual conversation and personal prayer. It's constant. It's always with us. God is always with us. as the natural. This is kind of an interesting thought. You might want to, if any of you, I don't know if I haven't noticed anybody sleeping, but if anybody is slept now, I just have 2 more sentences that I really like and I want you to listen to. They're so interesting. I think as the natural for the fish is what? Water, right? It's water. That's the natural habitat for the fish. And so with the truly monastic, the habitat of the monastery is the divine presence. That's our natural habitat, the divine presence. And this presence, the monastic life, monastic lives her entire life. We are always aware of that presence. And she shows her reverence for this divine presence by her silence. By her silence. Staying focused. Monastic silence is the key to Benedictine prayer and contemplation. To seek God is the primary purpose of the monastic. That's why we came here, isn't it? We say that, hear that over and over again. We came here, why? To seek God. To seek God. And such union with God, with faith, with hope, and with love as its expression, that is prayer. Prayer. But the atmosphere that is most conducive to prayer is silence. Silence and recollection. So I leave you with this one question for you to think about this evening as you read the chapter 6 of the rule on silence. Or maybe you want to look through 7 and 5 too. Go ahead. Anyway, the question is, how much do I truly value silence? How much do I, not we, how much do I truly value silence? Do I watch what I say? How much do I truly value silence? So thank you for your quiet listening. I appreciate it very much. And do take a look at my little friend on your way out, okay? She's really an exhausted, silent giver of life, I think. She's really a rough mother, as some of you probably know here. Okay, God bless. Have a nice evening, nice quiet